Hello, everyone. My name is Bethany Young-Holt, and I am the Executive Director of the Initiative for MPTs, or the IMPT. On behalf of the IMPT Secretariat staff, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for participating in today's webinar on driving impactful end-user research for more insightful MPT development. So we've tailored this new webinar series for those who might be newer to the MPT field, but we do hope that the discussion is useful for anyone interested in MPTs. Overall, we aim through this webinar to facilitate an instructive discussion among experts on their experiences with and lessons learned from conducting end-user research in the fields of contraception, HIV, and MPTs, to synthesize and share best practices for MPT product development and introduction. To start off the webinar, I'll provide a brief overview of MPTs and the IMPT, and then we'll dive into a moderated discussion with some great thought leaders who work in this area. During this portion, we will be muting the line for all participants. I'll then provide a few summary remarks, and we'll have some time for comments and questions from the audience. Audience members may participate in the discussion through the Raise the Hand feature, which is in the webinar platform and in the chat box. I'd also like to note that the panelists will be able to stay on for a few minutes after the 60-minute mark, depending on the volume of questions. So MPTs, or multi-purpose prevention technologies, address the interlinked sexual and reproductive health risk and deliver simultaneous prevention of at least two health risks: unintended pregnancy, HIV, and other STIs. I want to emphasize that we're talking about an array of prevention combinations. While a priority of MPTs has been on contraception and HIV prevention, MPTs encompass so much more, namely HIV and other STIs, contraception and non-HIV STIs, as well as combinations of STI prevention. Beyond the benefits we see in MPTs for advancing the health of women and girls worldwide, there are also potential social and economic benefits. There is a potential for greater efficacy in terms of cost, access, and delivery of sexual and reproductive health products. There is also the potential to capitalize on the demand in populations using one product type to achieve uptake of a second product. For example, women using contraception may be more inclined to use an HIV prevention product combined with contraception for a variety of reasons, such as ease of use and reduced stigma. The Initiative for MPTs is a product-neutral international collaboration of experts working together to advance the growing MPT field. With a long-term strategic vision for the field, the Initiative Secretariat facilitates collaboration among MPT stakeholders to optimize product development and introduction efforts, ensuring that the work is complementary and aligns with identified research priorities. So in this vein, today we are convening leading experts in the area of end-user research and sexual and reproductive health to help unpack this really important and challenging topic. So we'll be hearing today from Betsy Tolley of FHI 360, Anabel Gomez of AVAC, Amy Lynn of USAID, and Kate Guthrie of Brown University. So we'll start off the discussion by asking the panelists to introduce themselves. So Betsy, why don't we start off with you? Can you please briefly describe your role and experience in the field of end-user research?
Sure. Hi. So I'm currently the director of a behavioral and social science research division at FHI 360. But I've been working for probably 25 years now to better understand the acceptability of and adherence to a range of contraceptive and HIV prevention methods in different populations around the world. Some of that work has been, I guess most recently on PrEP use, but prior to that microbicide use, and before that even various contraceptive methods. Most recently, so a lot of my work has been using a range of methods, both qual and quantitative methods, and most recently I've had some experience around human-centered design work in the field of contraception.
Great, thanks, Betsy. Anabel, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm currently the head of marketing for AVAC. We're overseeing a multi-million-dollar adolescent girl and young woman project focusing on understanding behaviours and motivators to take up biomedical prevention and just generally HIV prevention as part of a two-part project. The other part is run by PSI, which is a test and treat project for young men. And the idea is that both these projects work together to break the cycle of transmission. Before heading up the marketing for AVAC, I was part of PSI's global marketing team with responsibility over sub-Saharan Africa, during which time the VMC project, the male circumcision project, which you'll get to hear about throughout this webinar, I oversaw the use and the implementation of that research, which is quite sophisticated human-centered design research in two countries, in Zambia and Zimbabwe. Prior to that, I've got decades of marketing experience, both in the not-for-profit and the private sector.
Thanks so much, Anabel. Amy, would you go next?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Amy Lin. I am the Market Access Team Lead for USAID Center for Accelerating Innovation and Impact. It's a group based in the Global Health Bureau that looks to bring private sector approaches and tools to global health challenges. And it also reflects my own experience, which spans both the private sector and the international development sector, in which I've been bringing these types of business tools in a variety of settings, including working and living in India, Liberia, and Peru. So really excited to think about how these apply to the MPT space as well. Some of the end-user research we've been doing recently has focused on the human-centered design approach. We've been looking at how we can think about designs and user experiences for the dipivirine ring, a microbicide, and drawing from research and experiences in Uganda and South Africa. We've also looked at oral PrEP and other microbicides through Project Emotion in South Africa. And then we've recently completed a project in India and Nigeria looking at how to provide family planning information and methods access to adolescents and partnering those human-centered design and end-user research insights with actual business models and potential private sector collaborations. So looking forward to this discussion.
Great, thanks, Amy. And Kate, could you wrap us up with the intros?
Sure. So I'm Kate Guthrie. I'm a professor in the Brown Medical School and the School of Public Health at Brown University, as well as a researcher at the Miriam Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island. I'm a psychologist by training and have spent the last 20 years doing behavioral science and HIV prevention, primarily on microbicides in the areas of acceptability and adherence. And in the last 10 years, I've spent the majority of my time developing what we're calling perceptibility science, which is really trying to understand and better measure the way that products are felt on a sensory level when women and their partners use them, whether that be a ring or a topical product of some kind, with the intention of trying to better understand that particular experience, the meaning that it makes in people's lives. You know, what does it mean for a product to feel a certain way or to behave in a certain way in someone's body, and then how that meaning plays into their choices about whether or not they're going to use those products in the future. And that's where I've spent most of my time lately.
Wow, great. Well, I'm really excited to have you all on this panel today. So I'd like to start off the discussion with what seems to be a growing movement around end-user research. So specifically, why is end-user research important to product development and introduction more generally? So Anabel, would you like to get us started with thinking through this?
Sure. So I think we're going to just start with actually understanding what end-user research is, and I apologise to those on the line who so what I was saying is I'm going to start with just defining what end user research is, and then just taking us through the process and then answering the question of why is it important, although I think it will be obvious as I go through the definition. So generally the problems that we're trying to solve are not our own. Generally they are from people in the field, from most of the people that are on the line. And we don't, unless we get some empathy with the people in the field, it's going to be very hard for us to come up with solutions, whether it's in a product or a service, that is going to be something that the end user wants and desires and is willing to use consistently and adhere to. So the beauties of end user work is that it's very empathetic. The process, underpinning the entire process, is empathy for the end user and understanding, having a deep understanding of the end user's desires, wants, abilities to change or to adhere, and understanding what context they operate in. And it's really important for us to understand these things and not come up with a solution first up and sort of let people not have a say in what they should use and how they should use it. So it is a very collaborative approach. Usually multidisciplinary teams are involved in end user research. So apart from having the users in the room or in the field with you, you'll find that there'll be possibly your doctors or your peer educators, whoever is necessary to have in the room for that to resolve a problem will be part of that Healing Centre design solution process and design process. It's a very optimistic process, which I really like, because if designers believe that you can fix the problem, and even if it's an old gnarly problem that's been out there for a long time, such as trying to get men to circumcise, bringing in fresh approaches does actually help you overcome some of the traditional barriers that we've seen. So there's an inherent optimism in, if we frame the question properly and we understand the end user, we'll be able to provide a solution that is acceptable. And it's a process that's very experimental. There is constant change in Healing Centre design research. It is very much about learning quickly, failing cheaply, which is a gift. So we're not going all the way down sort of through programs to understand what the pain points are. We understand very quickly what is the problem and then shift to either fix it or lose that particular concept or design if we can, and then move on to something that the end user is going to want. So I think, can we have the next slide, please? So this is just an outline of the process in broad terms. So the very first point of that is the empathy, which is what I've been talking about, which is actually understanding what the end user wants, how they operate, how we can affect their decision making, at what points we affect their decision making, what information do they need to know, how do they need to know it, and what is feasible for them to actually take on. So not just look at, is the drug efficacious, but is it feasible for them to actually use it, and how is it feasible for them to use it, and how do we make that desirable for them. From all these learnings, you define the problem. So it is not about coming into a situation with a definition, with the problem already defined. We are going to fix this by providing X drug. It's about really listening to people and figuring out what the problem is, to try and define the problem and then try to come up with a solution that's actually going to fit in with what the user wants. And then you go into a process which is called ideate, where you get all the inputs and you come up with a whole heap of concepts, and then you figure out which concepts, and it might be a concept around messaging, it might be a concept around service delivery, it could be anything, transport, it depends on the problem you're trying to solve. So you ideate, you figure out which concepts resonate the best, which are feasible, which are viable, and you'll hear me say this a lot through these 5 minutes of conversation, because it's not just all blue sky thinking. There has to be an overlay between what the user wants, but then also putting some criteria around what can actually be done. You go out, you prototype, which is very rapid prototyping, and you might do that for as long as you feel the project needs it. There's no hard and fast rule, but it's about going out into the field and testing that message, or testing the pamphlet, or testing the service delivery, or whatever it is that you're going to test, whatever you decide. And then you test, you measure, and then figuring out whether you need more iteration or whether it's at a point where you can go to scale with it. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I'm doing some technical assistance in Kenya on a project called Jalindi, which is a PrEP scale-up program. We've got, for adolescent girls and young women, men who have sex with men, and female sex workers, we've got probably about 6 prototypes that have gone out there. Some of the prototypes are very, very simple. It's about helping how to run a WhatsApp group. So you get to a point with that iteration where it's good enough for groups, community groups to use, and it's not a huge cost to the community. There are other prototypes which are going to be more costly, which involve events, which involve staging of events in different ways. And those will probably go through more testing and more piloting before they go to scale. So there's no hard and fast rule whether it's not a linear process. It's a process that goes back and forth, and it depends on your concept about whether you're going to scale or not scale. The other thing that is important about human-centered design and why that is important is because it's very much, it is about giving the people what they want. And it's a bottom-up approach that addresses human needs effectively, and this is the only way you're really going to get products and services to be used I think consistently. I think that, through public health, there's been a lot of us telling people what they should do rather than people telling us what they want. And this is where human-centered design is important. So if I go to the next issue that I wanted to discuss, which was the differences in approaches for development and introduction. So obviously the clearest issue here is in a product development, you've got a blank slate. So you're not going to have the restrictions that you have as opposed to coming up to a country with, for example, HIV self-test. When that was introduced, there was no discussion about what the product was going to look like. The oral swab was there. There was no degree of changeability. The effect that human-centered design did have on it is making sure the instructions for use were going to be understandable to everybody on the ground, and also that making sure that the way that we were distributing that product was in a manner that was going to link people to care, B, reduce social harm, but also in a manner that made people want to use it. So there was a whole heap of different delivery methods tested. Also for HIV self-testing is a blood prick. Again, if you are comparing one product to another, most people will tell you want an oral swab. But if you're going to introduce the blood prick, how do you introduce that in a manner that you want? In a manner that users want. But I think if the big issue with product development is that once we're into trials, we can say to people, okay, we might be able to ask people, do you want an injection to be in your arm or in your bottom? And do you want this to last 6 months or 7 months? The reality is that there are strict regulations governing trials, and you can't just simply shift and change. But in product development stage, early on, before you get to that sort of trial phase, it's really good to understand what people would want as you're developing the product. And it's important, as I keep saying, to overlap what user needs, what is feasible and what is viable and what is legally right. And an example of sort of products that have not taken into account sort of these 3 areas is, one is the Segway, and I don't know if people, those 2-wheel bike things, those 2-wheel scooters, I don't know what to call them, they're called Segways, that people use. The guy that put that together, his idea was that he was going to change the way we transport. He was going to change the way we sort of moved around cities. Great design. It's been reduced to basically being something that tourists use and that mall guards use, simply because he didn't take into account the fact that there was legal issues. He was neither a bike or a car, nor was he a scooter. So the fact, great design, but not taking into account the actual context that he was working in. The same with the Gene Expert, great TV monitoring device, but again, problems in terms of what the context was. So in terms of inconsistent electricity, lots of dust, lots of heat and humidity, and obviously the developers decided that has made amendments to the product. But again, human-centered design is about understanding where this product's going to be used and how it's going to be used, and by whom, and how they feel about the product and in what context. So, and the big differences are between introducing and not introducing, introducing a product and in development is what are the variations, or how much change can you affect on that product in essence. Thank you.
Anabel, that was really
I think we're up to the next
Thank you.
Speaker now.
So thank you, Anabel. Does anyone else, Amy, Kate, does anyone else have a quick comment before we move on to the next topic?
Sure. This is Amy, and I'll let Kate chime in as well if she is interested, or other panelists. I think Anabel provided an excellent overview of different ways of looking at end-user research, and specifically the human-centered design process. And I would just like to emphasize the multidisciplinary aspect that she spoke to and the iterative piece. And as she noted, it's very different when you're looking at product development versus introduction. So when you're exploring the design opportunities around an earlier stage product that's still in development, a lot of characteristics of the product can still change. But also you have to consider the different types of stakeholders you may be interacting with. So you may be looking at clinical researchers or bench scientists who are considering the feasibility of making those design changes to increase end user acceptability, and how possible that is from both perspectives, and considering those trade-offs. Whereas when you're thinking about a product that's already gone through a phase 3 clinical trial and is ready to be introduced in the market, very few physical traits can change, but then you have a much clearer idea of what exactly is possible, what you're working with, and how users might respond to it. So just to keep in mind, not only will you be looking at different opportunity spaces around what can be changed in terms of the product, depending on if it's early stage or late stage, but also are you working more with the researchers and the scientists at the early stage, or more with potential implementers and service delivery partners at the later stage? It's just something to keep in mind.
Thanks, Amy. Kate or Betsy, do you have anything to add? Otherwise, we'll move on to our next question.
Yeah, this is Kate. I guess I just want to also emphasize the nuance of what both Anabel and Amy are saying, especially in the product development phase, which is where I live. I can't really speak to the other side a whole lot. But my experience has often been that even when we have the luxury, because thus far I feel like it's been a luxury, even when we have the luxury of discussing potential products and really digging in deep about potential products with potential users, we're all human beings, and what we think we want and what we think we need and hypothesize about is not necessarily true in the long run when you get to the uptake side of things. And I think it's really important, at least it's been really important in my work to understand that, because it has been critical that we not just talk to people about what they think they need and what they think they want, or even show it to them in their hands. I mean, we have a whole, procedure on my team that we call in mono, that's all about literally putting stuff in people's hands. But it turns out that the hand isn't enough when you're talking about vaginas and rectums and penises and, all the things that we tend to talk about in the HIV contraceptive world. And that the actual experience of trying a product and or using a product, whether that's a formulation or a device or whatever, really changes a lot what people actually think when they go, oh, you meant like when you said smooth, you meant that. Oh, now I understand. Now my vagina knows what you're talking about. And that's been critically important. And I can talk later about the struggles that there are with doing that preclinically. But the nuance and understanding that people don't always have the best ideas right up front, and that those do need to change iteratively, and that we have to be open to that change really early on because we can't change it later on, is really critical.
Yeah, and I think this is Betsy, I think the only thing that I would add on to the earlier comments is thinking about human-centered design or end-user research in a broader way. There are a number of different methodologies that can and perhaps should be applied at different points along the product development, introduction, and kind of testing, I guess, progression. And so really digging in, using some of these HCD-like processes early on to be able, when it's possible, to be able to test and iterate around a particular design function is one place, perhaps within clinical trials. There may be other methods that are important, and even in introduction, there are additional ways to conduct end-user research that may be a bit more evaluative, that may be able to distinguish between uptake, sort of interest, barriers, facilitators, and uptake of a particular MPT-like product across different populations. So I think that's something we can come back to a little bit later.
Terrific. Thank you all. Now let's look at another broad topic. We'd like to hear from you all updates in the end-user research field and really look at where we are now. So we've heard some convincing arguments about the importance of this work. And this slide here offers a few probing questions to help us reflect on what the status is now in terms of end-user research. And all of you as panelists have expertise in this area. So Amy, would you like to get us started as we think through this?
I'd be happy to. I think one of the biggest updates that we've noticed in the field is how much interest and activity there is around this area now. How do we better understand the potential end users of MPT products or sort of their antecedents, the contraceptives or the HIV prevention methods like microbicides, and how can we learn from that so that we can be better prepared as we look to introduce new MPT products? I think one of the biggest gaps that we do have to confront is that we don't yet have an MPT in hand, and as Kate was just speaking to, the actual experience of a product really matters and can be very illuminating in what will an end user actually use and continue to use and get to that adherence so that they really benefit from the product attributes versus finding that as they undergo the process they may be turned off from it. So learning from the ongoing actual experience we can get from contraceptives and microbicides, but also recognizing the gap in knowledge that we have until we have MPTs more fully in use, I think is an important piece for us to keep in mind, and that hypotheticals will always be hypothetical until we get it confirmed by actual usage. I think the other piece I would highlight, and then we'll look forward to other viewpoints from my fellow panelists, is really thinking about the other viewpoints and perspectives that we need to integrate into this process. So even as we focus on how to better understand the end user, we also need to understand the interests or the implications for activities such as those who might procure a product, those who might actually deliver it or train providers on how to inform end users about it, manufacturers or companies who would actually supply the product. All of the trade-offs that we might have to consider as we think about changing an actual product or changing the marketing or the messaging around it will likely have cost or at least planning implications, and we need to keep those other perspectives in mind. And one example I'll just give is as we think about some of the work that we've done in India and Nigeria and looking at how do we better understand ways of reaching adolescents through areas that are outside of the health channel, so not through health facilities but more direct to consumer. We've been really thinking about non-traditional partnerships. Can we engage companies who are also trying to reach those same end users and find a way where our shared interests can be aligned in the same direction, so that then we can also leverage a greater set of skill sets and financial resources as we think about getting to our global health goal. So I would emphasize that we continue to have to keep an eye on how we will learn as more products come to market and more usage actually happens, and also to consider the range of viewpoints and perspectives that we need to take into account in order to use the insights and outputs from end user research and actually put it to transform it to actual impact.
Oh, that's great. Thanks. Betsy, do you have anything to add to that? Or Kate or Anabel?
I think one of the, this is Kate, one of the gaps that I've been particularly focused on, and I've started to speak about it at different things that I've gone to, so I might as well do it here, is as a psychologist, one of the things that is abundantly clear to me in the last 20 years, but more recently as we focus more and more on adherence in microbicides, and we'll need to in MPTs, is to really look at all of the constructs that facilitate or create barriers to motivation, and this whole thing we call motivation, motivation to adhere in the long run, but also motivation to try in the first place any given product. And I think those two are very different things, trying versus sustaining use, but also that much of our literature that we tend to rely on as scientists around motivation to adhere, for instance, is motivation to adhere to treatment protocols, to treatment drug regimens. And when someone has a disease and know they have a disease, their motivations are entirely different, or the degrees at which different pieces of motivation play into their equation of using that product are entirely different than those motivations that impact a prevention product. And I think this kind of goes back to what Amy was just saying about adolescents, but I think everyone across the spectrum of potential users, their motivation to use a product like this, I mean, especially now, there are many places where HIV, for instance, is still a death sentence in many ways, but in many places it's not anymore, and it becomes this chronic illness. And then so people are looking at years and years ahead of when they might actually see the consequence of the behavior that's about to occur right now. And that's just really hard for a human being to grapple with. And those motivations are just really, really different, and we really have to try to understand those better, because I don't think we've been barking up the right tree thus far, at least not as well as we could be. And I think the severity of consequences is really different. The economic costs, everything are very different when you're thinking treatment versus prevention. And I think that's a big area that we need to tackle at some point.
Yeah.
I'd like to just
Betsy.
Yeah, Bethany. Sorry, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, I think that is critically important, and will be even more, in some ways, complicated to tease out for a multi-purpose prevention technology.
Absolutely.
Where this sort of really HCD-like focus on design elements of, whether it's a product, it could also be a focus on, let's say, a communication message or some kinds of materials. I think that it's really important to apply some of our behavioral theory to understanding motivation and look at the way that various messages, sort of introductory messages, might play out for different populations. An adolescent woman, a sexually active adolescent girl in an African setting where HIV, so some of the research that I've done in the past, it's much easier for an adolescent girl to talk about HIV with an adult, to get tested perhaps, to think about using condoms, than it is for her to negotiate contraceptive use. That may be a very different perspective in an Indian setting where an adolescent girl is more likely to be married in an extended family setting. So I think that there's we need to figure out how to apply our best methods, sort of to understand end user motivations and behaviors. Some of that will be in this really rapid, immersive, iterative kind of HCD setting. Some of it will be drawing on our more traditional sort of social science behavioral methods to design, to test in a more kind of even a randomized study design way to test the impact of various messaging on motivations for product uptake or on actual adherence of products when we can actually evaluate how they're being used.
Thanks so much. So there's clearly no shortage of challenges and questions, as we think about end user research. So, really, what is the best way forward for the field? I think that's like a really important thing for us to now think about and discuss. So we, as the Initiative for MPTs, are currently working to identify the primary end user groups that would most benefit from an MPT. So wanted to flag that and stay tuned for those results. But once we identify where these populations are, what are the key considerations and approaches to making sure that we understand what they want and will use? So basically, what is the way forward for this field? I know all of our panelists have some great ideas about this. So Betsy, would you like to kick us off?
Well, so, I don't know that we have at the moment any, I was trying to think about any sort of large-scale studies at the moment that help us understand what the demands for various iterations of multi-purpose prevention technologies are. Seems like that would be something useful to know just overall. What kinds of products would various populations be most interested in? I was thinking about just some of the acceptability research that has been conducted within the confines of some of the clinical trials, even the long-acting injectable phase 2. There are questions about interest in using a longer-acting injectable HIV prevention product outside of a trial setting. There's high interest in that, but even higher interest if it were a multi-purpose product that was both HIV and contraceptive. But that's sort of one area of understanding. I think we really need to sort of better understand, as Kate said, some of the motivations that various types of women and men and couples would have around MPT use. I do think that there's still a lot of utility. I wanted Kate actually just to talk a little bit more about the perceptibility kinds of research that she's conducted. I think that there's some real value in doing some of that kind of work as these new products are even in the early stages of design. So anyway, I was going to see whether Kate might talk just a bit about that.
Yeah,
Sure.
That's great. And I know Anabel has some thoughts too, so that's great. Kate?
Okay.
Yeah, so just to kind of give people a bit of an overview. So the perceptibility work that we've been doing, as I said in my intro, is largely around what products feel like in the body. And that can be applied to topical products. It can be applied to devices like the intravaginal ring. It can be applied to injectables and implant, whatever devices that we have. But it also has to do with things like the actual dosing regimen and how long between doses, and all of that plays into how a user experiences a product. And the kind of the rub in it is that sometimes they experience something in their body that may or may not actually be attributable to a product, but they attribute it anyway because when we try something new as human beings, we're almost hyper-vigilant about that until we start to kind of get more habituated to it. But what we've been doing is actually creating measures, scales that we can use to measure these literally very discrete instances in time as people apply a product, walk around in their daily day, maybe have a bowel movement if they're using an intravaginal ring and what that's like for them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And literally this very sensory level experience. And we do a lot of in-depth qualitative work with them. And what's really interesting about that, and I think very telling, is that one, a lot of people have a lot of different experiences, many of which we don't really talk about in clinical trials, but are relevant enough to the users that they bring them up in an in-depth interview, and that they make meaning of those experiences in ways that we wouldn't necessarily anticipate. So I always provide the example of a topical gel, for instance, back when we were doing that, hopefully again with MPTs. Sorry, marketing. But leakage, for instance. I mean, when I started perceptibility work, leakage we thought was a huge problem, and it is for some women, and it's not for other women. But the experience of leakage itself. We had one woman who said to us, leakage is good because it means that when the gel leaks out of my vagina, it's taking the virus with it. And another woman said, well, leakage is bad because if the gel's not in my vagina, then I'm not being protected. And in reality, depending on the pharmacokinetics of the drug that's in that gel, they are both wrong scientifically. But it doesn't matter that they're wrong. And this is what we've learned over time with the perceptibility work, is it really doesn't matter that they're wrong in a very technical, true or false sort of way, correct or incorrect sort of way. It matters because they've created that meaning, and that meaning is going to is going to, elicit their future behaviors with the product, regardless of whether they're right or wrong. The other thing I think, that is true about being able to measure these things, the experience that women have and their partners have, or the couple, as Betsy pointed out, together has, because I think that's very different. Her experience, his experience in the case of heterosexuals, and their experience together as a couple. All those are three very different things, and we have to understand all of them. And I think some of our science and our ability to measure those things also needs to advance, beyond the perceptibility stuff that we've done. And I guess, one of my examples here is actually a contraceptive study that we did recently, where I was actually had the pleasure of doing the in-depth interview with the woman, and what we had done throughout their experience was call them every day in kind of a ecological momentary assessment sort of way, and ask them questions about their product use and their sexual experience that day, and yada yada. And this woman comes in afterwards and sits down for an in-depth interview with me, and she's all bent out of shape because she feels bad about herself because she's not having sex as often as she should, and she's about to get married, and she's just being, she's just not a good future wife. And she was really pained in that experience. And luckily for me, I had the EMA data, and I shoved 3 calendars of data in front of her. And I had ahead of time, not that I knew she was going to think this, but I had all of her sexual experiences highlighted in one color. I had, her product use highlighted in a different color. I'm like, so what do you think? And she's like, wow, I'm having a lot of sex. Maybe I'm not so bad after all. So this kind of takes me back to what I was saying before. It's like, it's not, we're human beings here, and we have to remember that a direct question is not always the best way to get the answer. And when I do qualitative training with my staff, I always talk about going in the back door, going in the front door, the one on the side, which was something my grandmother used to say all the time. But she had a breezeway door that was literally on the side, and sometimes you have to ask a different question to get at what's really going on. And I think there's 4 amazing women on this panel right now. I probably shouldn't include me, but there's 3 amazing women and me on this panel right now, and we all have incredibly different disciplines and very similar disciplines, and we come at stuff from different angles. And I think we have to do more and more of that stuff, both really early in the development process. and if I might just add, because it's dawning on me at the moment, bioengineers and biochemists and those guys who and women who actually make those products, who design these devices, they are amazing individuals with incredible creativity, and most of them can actually talk to me, who can't really explain things well to them, but can create something that can work. I mean, they're just really creative. I come up with ideas. Oh, I wish I could do this, and they're like, oh, I could do that. It's like, wow, really cool. So I think even on that level, it's not just the marketing people and the HCD people and the psychologists and social scientists and anthropologists, but the bioengineers early on in the preclinical development process can be incredibly helpful. As long as we know what to tell them we're shooting for. So I want to put a shout out to them, because I think they've really done amazing work along the way, and I think can do even more if we challenge them a little bit.
Bethany, could I add on to that for just a second?
Yeah, and then
I'll make it very quick. I mean, it's that premise is a little bit what is driving a project that I have been involved in to basically ideate and come up with new sort of out-of-the-box blue sky contraceptive methods, kind of in what's the next generation of contraception. And we did apply a human-centered design approach to and bringing together after very rapid sort of end-user research, bringing together biochemists and marketing folks and clinicians and sort of a real range of people to take that information and be thinking about, well, what would be more user-focused, more responsive to the needs of users in various countries along different sort of life stages. And so I do think that is one place that we could be doing more earlier, and hoping to spark those kinds of ideas, those concepts that can be taken up by these product engineers, biochemists, et cetera, to kind of move the field forward. And I'm sure that that's an area for MPT research that could be quite useful.
That's great. Thank you.
Amy, I'll just add one quick line on this, because I think it's such an important point that both Betsy and Kate are raising, is thinking about drawing on different types of expertise, and that really helps us really apply what we're learning from end-user research. And so I really think we're in an exciting place where a lot more end-user research is being done around this cohort and around these products and these needs, but we really have to find a way to make those as valuable as possible. So do we bring in the bioengineers? Do we have ideation sessions? Do we talk to service delivery partners? Do we talk to manufacturers? Let's figure out how to apply what we've learned so that we really all generate the benefit for that.
Thanks, Amy. I think that's spot on. And I think it's a great way to now sort of transition into our final question before we go into the Q&A. And that is, what are the challenges that you all have encountered in your work when conducting end-user research and in other areas? And do you think that these challenges persist now as we're moving into MPTs? So Anabel, would you like to get us started on that, and then we can wrap up?
Sure, no problem. So I think there's a couple of really big challenges that the field's grappling with at the moment, and one is measurement. So how do we measure the effectiveness of HCD? And it's very difficult because it is so enmeshed in different processes and procedures. So actually making an argument, a cost argument, if you like, for human-centered design is not straightforward. Everybody on the phone will be happy to know that some very clever people, certainly Anabel from JSI is looking at measurement, and there's a lot of people out there that are trying to think about how do we better measure what human-centered design can bring. Also, as discussed earlier, there's a lot of projects out there that are talking about human-centered design in population groups. So how do we gather those all that information? How do we find out if there's universal truth? How do we scale it so that every time we don't have to start from scratch on a human-centered design project? And that is, again, a topic of conversation that's happening at a fairly big global level, but with adolescent girls and young women, there is a lot more focus certainly through our project and through the Adolescent 360 project that Gates is funding along with CIF, and it's in 3 countries, and it's focused generally specifically on adolescent girls and young women and sexual reproductive health. So there's, how do we make sure that those links are strong between the projects so that as I start the adolescent girls and young women work in South Africa, what can I learn from what's gone on before me with the A360 project? I think one of the other big issues is the focus on end users. We need to figure out that the end user, there might be multiple end users. So yes, the end user might be the woman who gets the injection in the bottom, but it could also be the provider. And so for example, the provider is an end user of the product in a different way. So trying to identify all those product touch points and how much interaction and we need to have with them as well. So I think it's very important that sometimes we look at the whole journey of the woman and what her touch points and levers are and who might be an end user, as I said, a provider, because if a provider is not interested in using your product, it's not going to happen. The Gene Expert, again, I go back to that, it's a perfect example where they weren't comfortable with the product, they had a few errors in it, so they went back to the old way of using, of diagnosing tuberculosis. So we need to really figure out what the problem is and what the journey is for human-centered design, measure it and figure out how we scale it. What you have on the screen at the moment is some preliminary work, and there's actually a handout that AVAC has done looking at the pain points for end user work, both from a donor perspective and also from a implementer perspective, that sets out what the major pain points are and some mitigation work. Like a good human-centered design project, what you're seeing here is draft 1. It's been iterated on, so it's been sent out to the field broadly and widely. There is an abridged version that you guys can access. I'm sure the team that's organised the webinar can get it to you. There is also a community of practice that is being developed that will also try and provide guidance, skills, the ability to scale human-centered design, and also help people figure out where is it relevant to have human-centered design in its purest form. Where do you bring in other disciplines like behavioural economics? Is it enough just to have human-centered design with the developers, or do we want another sense of research science involved in it as well? The answer is probably going to be yes most of the time. How do we universally communicate a new benefit, which is what prevention is, certainly around HIV? How do we communicate that, and how do we learn from the way we've communicated that in one place to another, in one region to another? So there's a lot of work going on there to help support, also to help the field understand that embarking on a human-centered design project is not easy. It's not a golden unicorn. It takes a lot of effort. And for example, when we rolled it out both in Zimbabwe and Zambia for VMMC, we had to change entire work structures and recruitment structures, supervisory structures, and reward structures. So, you don't change one thing on this woman's journey to uptake the product without looking at all the systemic changes and having to go in there with your eyes wide open and making sure that the field has got the right amount of support and provision to actually take up the change is vitally important. I'm going to wrap it up. There is certainly happy to talk to anybody about the community of practice offline, and as I said, we can share this initial work on the findings on the pain points. I'll hand it back to you, Bethany.
Thank you, Anabel. And thank you, Betsy, Amy, and Kate as well for this insightful discussion around such an important and clearly complicated topic. In-user research is so critical for ensuring the success of these kinds of prevention products, and we're also hearing that there are numerous methodological issues and challenges that need to be considered. At the same time, it is great to see increased support for this work from USAID, NIH, and others. If people that are on this webinar are interested, you can check out the MPT resources and funding opportunities that are on the IMPT website. So now I want to move on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. We've already had a couple questions come in, but as a reminder for those who have questions or comments, we ask that you please use the raise a hand feature on the website or on the platform. State your name, affiliation, and your question. You may also provide a question or comment in the chat box. So now we will open the line for participants to ask questions or share comments. If you're not speaking, please press *6 to mute and *7 to unmute. If you've dialed into the audio through your computer, you can mute yourself that way. As we mentioned at the beginning, we're happy that our panelists have agreed to stay on a few minutes longer, depending on the volume of questions. So I'm going to begin with a question from Barbara Freeland from the POP Council. And her question is, how do you incorporate the regulatory requirements into testing different prototypes and going back to users in an iterative process? It seems like it might be difficult to make immediate changes to a prototype without going back to the regulatory agency in between the iterations. It would be helpful if you could address the regulatory aspects of HCD. So which of our panelists would like to take a stab at that? And then we have a couple others that are coming in.
I can start.
Okay, Kate. And why don't you just state your name just to remind people.
So this is Kate. Barbara, thank you so much for that question. This is the bane of my existence. It is incredibly, in the preclinical framework where we're literally developing, formulations or devices or whatever, it's incredibly hard. One of the biggest problems that I run into, and I'm not going to say this well because I'm not, a bioengineer, but basically, when you take a gel of certain characteristics and rheological properties, and you add drug A, those properties change. If you add drug B instead, the properties change, but are also different from the ones that it was with drug A. So part of my problem in perceptibility work has been, how do I create a formulation or device? That device is probably a little bit easier because it's more biomechanical, although I'm not actually sure about that. But how do we create a formulation that we can test early that has the same characteristics as what we hope will be our end product with respect to drug inside? And that requires that we go through the, at least when you're funded by the Division of AIDS at NIH, it requires that you go through all the safety testing that you would for any drug, which is a lot of money that we often forget about when we write, a grant proposal, but often just don't have. So in my preclinical work, I have often had to resort to things like in mono procedures and a lot of in-depth interviewing that really digs at people's thinking and meaning making so that we can try to extrapolate some of that stuff, because once you do get to different forms that have active ingredient in them or even that don't, the regulations are insurmountable unless, you have
limiting.
A benefactor of sorts.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. Well, I'm seeing that we are reaching our 60-minute mark for the webinar. And as I said, the panelists will stay on the line if you have more questions. But if you need to sign off at this time, a full recording will be available on the IMPT website. So thank you. Did anyone have any other comments to Barbara's question? Otherwise, I will move on to Sumia Rama Rao's question from the POP Council. Okay, I'll go on with that. So Sumia poses this question. It would be helpful for the field if the panelists could comment on how to differentiate in a major way end-user research and social behavioral research. For example, is it the stakeholders involved, the timing, the speed of process? As a panelist said, it is rapid, immersive, and iterative. Or is it the research process or all of the above? So thank you, Soumya. Who would like to answer that or respond?
Yeah, Bethany, I'd like to at least start it because it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit, especially having conducted, a number of different studies focused on understanding acceptability or adherence, inside and outside of clinical trials, and then more recently being involved in some of this human-centered design research. And one of the things that strikes me, human-centered design, at least the way that I understand it being applied by IDEO, by some of the design firms, is a much broader, kind of a different process. It includes some end-user research as well, and the focus is very much on modifying some kind of a design solution, whether it's a product or it could potentially be a program or a service, or let's say a communication material. It's focused on that particular product or material, and the idea is to ensure that it is meeting the needs of the potential users who will be either using the product or hearing the messages, et cetera. That immersive research that takes place up front, and there's a kind of research packaging around the entire process, but especially that end-user research that happens up front, at least from my perspective, is one of the important reasons to do it is for the designers themselves, and it may be a multidisciplinary sort of group of designers, but for them to develop the kind of empathy that's needed in order to come up with solutions that actually are responsive to end-user needs. And so the experience that I've had around this end-user research is quite different from the kind of social behavioral research that I or colleagues of mine have been involved in other settings, in the sense that it is very rapid, that we as researchers, regardless of whether or not we are from the particular population where the research is being conducted, we're there in the field asking questions, coming up with insights, sort of rapidly analyzing these data. It's quite a different process from the more protocol-driven, traditional sort of behavioral research that I've been involved in the past, and in a place where we as social science researchers are concerned about the effect, the impact that our own presence in the field might have in terms of the kinds of information that we elicit from participants. So I see the rationale for the kind of end-user research, and even some of the approaches around it as a bit different. And there may be, I think one of the interesting things to do to look at the moment is where might there be good synergies? I mean, where can we incorporate more of that immersive, sort of insightful, creative process into some of the more traditional research that we've done? On the other hand, where are we making some big trade-offs when we don't keep some of the processes that we've developed over the last, 20 years, I'd say, in terms of thinking about measurement, thinking about how we recruit our participants, how we collect data from them, what are some of the potential biases that get incorporated into that if we've not really thought it through. So anyway, that's just a place to jump off.
Thank you so much, Betsy. We are now going to open the line for participants to ask questions or share comments. And again, if you are not speaking, I just want to remind you to please press the *6 to mute and press *7 to unmute. So as the audience gathers their questions and thoughts, I would like to get the discussion started with a question of my own. So much of the emphasis of MPT end users so far has been in settings in sub-Saharan Africa. But can you, as panelists, also speak to a potential end user in a U.S. or Western setting? Similarly, in what ways is it important to think about a U.S. end user for MPTs? For example, several MPTs in development address prevention of non-HIV STIs, including HSV, in addition to HIV and contraception. So would someone like to respond to that?
I can very quickly just tell you a few end user studies that have gone on in the US in both the private and public sector. But, you know, just to open up, IKEA normally gets its new products from in-depth end user immersion. It is a standard for IKEA to spend something like 200 days. Their marketing people and their product design people spend around 200 days with possible users of their products. They actually live with them in their little apartments and come up with all these amazing space-saving ideas that, you know, we buy at the shop. And that's very human-centered design, and they've been doing that for a very long time. Walmart's, the reason that we've got aisles as wide as we have and the lighting that we have in Walmart stores is because of end user design, to try and figure out what's going to be best for the end user. Similarly, that very frustrating, back to IKEA, that very frustrating way of getting through the shop was as a result of end user design and trying to maintain a customer trail in a flow in the manner that you wanted, which is why you've got those shortcuts now, because they discovered that forcing people down a particular flow wasn't working for them. So that's just some very global positioning of end user. I know of about four end user studies here, not in MPTs, but certainly there is a big end user study being conducted by an organisation called GoBe on violence against women, domestic violence against women in California. There has been multiple end user projects conducted in the school field. One notably, I think it was in Oregon, by an organisation called The Greater Good, looking at getting children less waste in school foods and getting children to eat more healthily. So what's the different ways of doing that? Do you serve them at the table? Do you sit and talk to them about their food? Do you continue with the lineup? It's not just about limiting their choices. It's not just about giving them healthy food at the cafeteria, because they will go and buy Coke or they will go and buy something sugary outside. It's about actually changing that behaviour, and how do you change the behaviour? So that, and they've been quite successful. There's also been quite a lot of end user work conducted in hospitals with children. So there is a hospital, they discovered that one of the greatest anxieties for children was actually not undergoing the test because they're probably sedated, but in the run-up to going for a test, going down the corridors of the hospitals, it was very stressful for the children. So the question for them was, how might we reduce the stress? How might we make this fun for children and therefore the parents to reduce the stress? So I think the hospital in San Juan, I can't remember where it is, but it's again in one of the around California, where the children are being given little sort of mobile cars that they drive themselves around the hospital to the sites where they have to get the test. So they make it a lot of fun to go there, and it's been proven to reduce their stress. So that's a couple of examples of it being used here. I don't know in the MPT field, but just generally how human-centered design is being used.
And this is Amy. Maybe just to build on a few of those examples, I think another example might be in the case of diabetes, where a diabetes treatment manufacturer was really trying to understand how to help their patients or end users take their medication more regularly. And the common understanding or the common wisdom at the time was, well, it's forgetfulness. And so the company had been really focused on reminders or a way of just having a regular app or something to remind the end user when it's time to take the medication. And the end user research really started to uncover that it was really more around stigma. And so while somebody might be out at lunch or something else, if it was ever inconvenient or in a public space to take that medication, then they would just skip it. And it wasn't so much as forgetting, but it was inconvenient. They didn't want to disclose that they had the disease. And so I think some of those insights, as Kate was saying, that side door way of getting at these questions can be really helpful, whether it's in the U.S. or in sub-Saharan Africa. I think the other piece that's another example that could be instructive for us as we think about MPTs is just some of the logistics that make a difference. And so one HCD project, Human-Centered Design project, was really looking at the packaging of medicines and trying to make it more efficient. But as they tried to roll it out and did some of this rapid prototyping, they realized that their recommendation was making it more complicated for the pharmacies to unpack the medicines and get to them. So it might have been easier at some level for the end user, but that intermediary, the pharmacy, also needed it to be easier, to be more organized, to have less waste, et cetera. And so they had to sort of iterate on this to get to a more optimal packaging system. So I think as we get to that next step of, well, how do we put these to use? How do we apply them? Thinking through those nuts and bolts of, well, who is going to interact with this product or this intervention all along the way, and let's make sure that it's in everyone's interest to use it well, can be really instructive as we think about it for low and middle income settings.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Can I add one more thing about that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
This is Kate. I just wanted to, I don't know, maybe I'm in an existential mood, but I just wanted to also say that I feel like one of the differences between our more behavioral social science standardized Western approach to science and how we do these things and the way the HCD field does it are not necessarily different. But I think sometimes we forget the places where either is exceptional and the places where we're actually very, very closely aligned. And I think that's also true for populations. So, you know, I think we sometimes get caught in a trap in our brains of thinking about how, you know, women in India are different than women in sub-Saharan Africa are different than women in the U.S. And while there's probably some places where folks are very exceptionally different on certain things, there are also many places where we are all just women, we are all just men, we are all just users of these products, and I think some of that is the stuff that we need to figure out and get rid of the places that we don't really need to worry about any differences, and focus on the things where we do, and really get into the meat of that. So I used to, you know, there's a place in one of my transcripts where I said to someone, you know, vagina is a vagina is a vagina, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, for some of this stuff, it's like we all have the same needs. We might express them differently. We might have different meanings we derive from different experiences, but ultimately, it is what it is, and we just have to figure that out. So I'm not sure there's as much discrepancy as there is similarity between continents.
Yeah.
In some respects, anyway. There are other vastly different things, you know, around economics and how systems work and all that kind of stuff. But in some ways, I almost feel like we make it harder sometimes.
Kate, thank you. Really insightful comments. Well, the line is open, so if people would
The conference
like
has been unmuted.
Yeah, so the line, as you hear, the line is unmuted and open. So if anyone has any question that they'd like to raise to the group, the floor is yours. So Somia, I see that you have a comment you put in the question chat box, but would you like to, if you're unmuted, would you like to share that with the group?
Sure, thanks, Bethany. This is Soumya Ramarao from the POP Council. So I wanted to confirm what Kate was talking about, that some motivations, needs, and experiences are universal. And we've seen that same sort of result emerging from the work we've done around vaginal rings. So we know whether the woman is a European or whether she lives in the Dominican Republic or in Africa or India. The experiences all seem to be the same. They find the ring easy to insert, remove, they know how to use, how it feels. It's all of those responses have been fairly similar no matter the setting. Because early on when we started the work for acceptability of rings in Africa, the thought was that, in these settings, there's not much use of vaginal products, so maybe the ring may be felt differently in those places. But that's not really been the case. So I wanted to affirm what Kate just shared with us.
That's great. That's real practical feedback and experience. So thanks for sharing that. Kate, did you have anything else to add? Anyone else?
No, I mean, I think that this is Betsy, I think that that's really true. And even maybe building a little bit on Kate's earlier comments, even when health systems, sort of cultural systems may differ from one country to the other to some extent, there may be similarities within certain populations, across different countries, different geographic settings. So in some ways it is digging in and trying to understand, what those contexts, what those either constraints to use or facilitators of using a particular product are within a subset of people. I think we need to use our best methods, find new ways to use the methods and in some sort of combined way to better understand what those sort of use contexts are.
Thanks a lot, Betsy. So are there any other questions that anyone would like to add that are posed, that are calling in?
Bethany, this is Kate again. I just had another comment that I'm feeling compelled to make. Sure. Back when I was talking about motivations for treatment and prevention, the other layer there is also understanding, for MPTs, is understanding the different motivations that exist for what users want out of a product that will prevent an infection of any kind, whether it be HIV or an STI or whatever, and a product that would prevent an unwanted pregnancy. And when I listen to my U.S.-based women around these issues, they're sometimes in conflict with each other, in that the sexual experience that users want or think that they want might be different in those two scenarios. In a disease prevention scenario, they might want a product that is covert or discreet, as we say in the literature. But in a pregnancy prevention scenario, given that you can stop worrying about pregnancy because you have a contraceptive on board, you want to enjoy that sexual experience potentially in the same way that you would want to enjoy it if it were a covert disease prevention experience, but not necessarily. So while we have to understand motivation with respect to treatment and prevention, we also need to understand motivations with respect to contraception and disease prevention around the user experience. And I'm focused on that sensory experience, but I think we can extend that out to everything that all the panelists have talked about. And that's going to be particularly important in an MPT where it is one product. It is one thing. And it may be the case that sometimes you can't get both experiences in the same product, and then we're going to have to think that through.
Great, thanks, Kate. We'll have time for just probably one or two more questions. This question just came in, and it looks like it's directed to you, Kate, but others on the panel may have more to add, and it comes in from Hamaria Hanif. It is thinking about who the end users are that we sample, especially at the preclinical stage. How do you target and segment the population? Do you make changes based on just a few responses? So Hamaria, if you have anything more to add or clarify, please do. Otherwise, Kate.
I'll give Hamaria a second. Okay, that's a really great question, and I was actually thinking about it earlier in the context of another response. So thank you for that. For me, the way I try to do that is, much of my work is qualitative, and one of the sampling strategies in qualitative methods is purposive sampling. So unlike a big large clinical trial where you have lots of people and you assume the representativeness of a sample, in qualitative research, which is much more in-depth and you typically use smaller samples, you purposely define your set. And you may have to do this piece by piece depending on funding and timing and the product that you're looking at, but basically you want to be really thinking about your target audience in a sense. Probably the clearest way to think about it would be kind of a 2x2 or a 3x2 design in a sense. If you think about that in an intervention perspective, you can also use those same kind of visual categories as I talked to you over the phone. But like for me, two of the most important things when I was doing perceptibility work for vaginal gels was the age of the person and how age impacted vaginal geography, and hormonal cycle and all that kind of stuff. And the other question that was really important for us was how different products felt depending on whether the woman had given birth vaginally in the and potentially even how many times she had given birth vaginally, because that changes the vaginal geography. So we were really interested in this kind of combination or interaction of the product and the actual geography of the vagina and the elasticity of the vagina and all that kind of stuff. So we literally recruited and enrolled women into our study to equally fill those cells of that 2x2 or 2x3 design. And then each cell was filled with enough people that from a qualitative perspective we had credibility in the data. And that helped us then decide, or not decide, but it gave us the sample that we were looking for. So I think one of the key things about doing this work up front is that you will have smaller samples, but you really have to think through the things that could be playing a part in your data, understand what you want to do with that data analytically at the end and what the questions that you really want to answer, and then literally choose the sample. Or not choose a sample, but wait for the sample to appear, I guess, within those categories, so that you can really have a credible argument. And then what we tend to do is fill the cells that kind of match the way we're doing the questioning. So if we need to hear from everyone, then everyone is in the first iteration, a couple of everyone, if you will, and then we change things up based on those answers, and then we have everyone in the second iteration, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very thought-through process on how we make that happen and who's in the room and hence who our data are coming from. Does that answer the question, I hope?
Thanks so much, Kate. Yeah, I think that's great. And again, I think people can follow up if they have want more clarification.
Sure, absolutely.
So I have one more final question that has come in, and I think that then we'll sort of wrap up and conclude our webinar. So we have one more question from Emily Krogstad from RTI International, who says her audio is not working, which is too bad. But so I'll do my best to capture her question. She is a bioengineer, and she says that while she can see a need and design toward that need, she's interested in shifting the design itself more toward end users. Does anyone have examples or comments on how to involve end users more in the ideation or prototyping phase, as opposed to getting feedback on something that's already an existing prototype? Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and hopefully someone can answer that in a minute or so, and then we'll have to conclude. So thank you, Emily.
I can take that very quickly if you like. But before I take that, and that is a really excellent question, I just wanted to talk very quickly about segmentation, because it's different from sampling. And Kate gave an excellent background on how you do sampling before the product goes to market. Post the product going to market, there is segmentation that we talk about, and that's not just demographic. That can be done along somebody's need for the product, somebody's behaviour, the time they use the product. So that's a really big box that we don't have time to explore, but I just wanted to draw out the difference between segmentation and I think sampling there, which I think is kind of important. To answer the RTI question, if you want to get people in, the best way of getting end user experience is getting people in the room, going out to the field, the people that you think are going to use your product, and start really broad and get them into the field, get their hands dirty, give them some prototypes, and ask them to design the product. What would be the ideal product for them? Give them some guidelines, introduce a criteria so it doesn't go too broad, and then bring it back. So have some broad criteria and then bring it back. But the best way of doing it is to just go out there and talk to them. But before you do that, immerse yourself in that community, because that's the whole process of human-centered design. Go out there, live with them, or follow them, or spend time at the beach with them, or in a bar with them, or whatever is appropriate. But just get out there and speak to them. That's the only way that I can recommend that you get the feedback. Otherwise, it's going to be literature reviews and extrapolating from literature reviews. And as you do that, I would also, to Amy's point, when you're talking about making packaging or every touch point along that user experience, think about who else you need to have in that room so that those touch points are covered in terms of your inputs into that product development.
Thank you so much, Anabel. Any final comments before we wrap up from our panelists? Okay, well, I just want to thank our amazing panelists again for all the thought that you put into preparing for this webinar. And all the rich discussion. So the webinar it has been recorded and it will be posted on the IMPT website. This now concludes the webinar, and I want to thank all of the expert panelists as well as everyone who has participated by calling in and submitting your questions. So wishing you all a wonderful